Hello, I'm David Sigrist, a PhD candidate at Stellenbosch University and a junior fellow at the John William Weaver's Institute for Septuagint Studies. And I have here with us Dr. Rob Hiebert, who is the professor of Old Testament at the Graduate School of Theological Studies at Trinity Western University and director of the John William Weaver's Institute for Septuagint Studies. It's good to have you here today through Zoom.
Thanks, David.
Yep. So today we're going to talk about your career, a bit about the Institute and some of the projects we have going on.
Sounds good.
First thing we'll start is just an introduction to what the Septuagint is and what your background and training has been. So could you just talk about how you were introduced to the field and what your path was to lead you where you are today?
Sure. I guess, excuse me, after my high school education, I went to a local Bible college. I guess it was called the Bible Institute here in the city where I live, Columbia Bible Institute, and obviously got basic training in biblical studies in general. From there, I went on to, that was basically a 2-year diploma. I went on to what was then called Trinity Western College, which was a junior college. So they offered a 2-year undergraduate diploma called an Associate in Arts. And I basically took a general humanities and sciences program. Towards the end of that period, I was thinking about what my future might hold, and actually thought about what kinds of things I thought were important, and what kind of rose to the top was the Bible, biblical studies. And I wasn't quite sure at that point what that might look like. In fact, for a time, I was considering archaeology. Near Eastern archaeology, biblical archaeology. I explored a number of programs, primarily in the U.S. at various colleges. And about that time, at Trinity Western College, a speaker arrived to talk about an institution in Jerusalem, which was at that time called the Institute for Holy Land Studies. Currently, it's Jerusalem University College. And I thought, well, if I'm going to be studying biblical studies, archaeology, why not, and particularly Near Eastern archaeology, why not go right to Jerusalem? So that's what I did and ended up there. Did take a little bit of introductory archaeological survey sort of instruction, but ended up starting to work in the area of Hebrew, and actually took modern Hebrew immersion called Ulpan, and then moved into biblical Hebrew. So that was a 1-year program for undergraduates. I returned from there, was still uncertain as to what I might do, was thinking a variety of fields, communications, journalism, Near Eastern studies, and that sort of thing. And in the course of time, ended up at the University of Toronto, the Department of Near Eastern Studies, and then began to work in a more focused fashion in the area of biblical languages. So then I started studying Greek as well as Hebrew and Aramaic and Syriac and that sort of thing. And at that time, of course, at the University of Toronto in the Near Eastern Studies Department were 2 Septuagint scholars, John Weavers and Albert Pietersma. And so my interest in biblical studies led me to think in terms of what to focus on. And the languages, biblical languages, Hebrew and Greek, it seemed like a nice fit to think in terms of Septuagint, because you're working both in Greek and Hebrew Bible. You're being equipped to work in Hebrew Bible as well as New Testament studies. So over time, that kind of resolved itself into a
Right.
specialization in that area. And so as I went on to graduate school, then the focus was specifically Septuagint studies. And at the time, I think it was probably certainly the only place in North America, maybe elsewhere as well, where you could actually major in Septuagint studies and pursue doctoral studies in that area. So over time, that's kind of what emerged, and that's how I ended up in Septuagint studies in particular.
Yeah, that makes sense. And through kind of your background, Septuagint studies itself requires a working knowledge of a few different fields, right? From just Hebrew Bible to with the working with the Greek language and with intersections later. So on the one hand, some people think of it as a relatively niche field, but we who work in it know that it's really at the juncture of a lot of different areas of research that can really bring a fresh perspective. So was that something that in your decision to focus on Septuagint that seemed to appeal to you when you reached that
Yeah, I would say
point?
that was I would say that was a certainly prominent feature in my thinking. As I said, working in a range of languages associated with
Yeah.
original biblical texts, working in both testaments from a Christian perspective,
Mm-hmm.
and then of course within that field, that general area, there was certainly interconnections with areas like the scrolls. I remember doing some studies in that area, some introductory studies in that area.
Okay.
And of course, eventually ending up at Trinity Western, where we had, by the time I arrived, already a Dead Sea Scrolls Institute.
Right.
And within the field of Septuagint studies, of course, what was pretty prominent, at least in certain sectors of the Near Eastern Studies Department of the University of Toronto, was textual criticism. John Weavers was working on his Pentateuch volumes for the Göttingen Septuaginta,
Absolutely.
and others, delving into different aspects, literary studies, literary critical studies, and so on. So it opened up a number of avenues for me, potential avenues for how things might proceed.
Sure. Sure. Not to mention just translation studies as well informs a lot of the techniques that we use.
Right.
Yeah. So you mentioned at the University of Toronto when you were there, you had Weavers and Petersma was there. Could
Right.
you just talk to just some of your memories from the other professors, other students, and opportunities you had at the program?
Sure. My first memory of that department, where Weavers and Petersma were situated, was actually, I think it was probably a late August summer day, as I had arrived in Toronto in advance of the program actually starting for me in the fall. And I found my way into the department, and I think maybe one of the only people, it might have even been a Friday afternoon in the summer. And one of the only people there at the time, I think, was John Weavers. And he was working on, I don't know, maybe Deuteronomy, and was chairman of the department at the time. And so I started to talk with him, and he was kind of sizing me up to see where I might fit in terms of my background and that sort of thing. So that was my first experience with the personnel there. Over time, of course, got to know Al Petersma very well, both as I finished my undergrad and then moving into graduate studies. Did some teaching as a teaching assistant under their supervision, both of them, in the area of Greek texts, New Testament, some of the apocryphal literature and other materials. So that was, getting my feet wet in terms of that sort of academic work. Others who were there included John Revel, of course, a well-known specialist in the area of Masoretic studies, Paul Dion, also exegetical studies, Aramaic and that sort of thing. Don Redford was an Egyptologist. Kirk Grayson in the area of Mesopotamian studies. So I think at the time and shortly afterwards, a lot of us who were in the program at the time kind of felt we were there in kind of the golden age of that department. I mean, things have changed in terms of focus. It's now the Department of Near Eastern Near Eastern Civilizations, I think it's called. And so various focus areas have shifted in terms of prominence, but there was quite a group there. And then, of course, some of my fellow classmates would include people who are well known in the area of Septuagint studies: Claude Cox, Larry Perkins, Peter Gentry, Cameron Boyd Taylor. Cameron came after, as did Yana Smith. So there was, a pretty good group of people there, and others that I haven't mentioned, who, we got to know very well over the years. And as I said, I had opportunities to work as a teaching assistant, which was great in terms of experience and also earning a little money to support myself. Research assistantship work with Al Petersma, who was at the time had a project focused on the Psalter. And so I and others who worked with him as research assistants got opportunity to do collation of manuscripts. I think we worked through something like 400 Byzantine Psalter manuscripts, sections of them.
Okay.
And so that kind of got me into the area of textual criticism, which was useful in terms of where my dissertation eventually focused on one of the Syriac versions of the Psalms, the so-called Syro-Hexapolaric Psalter.
Yep.
So I got exposure to textual criticism work hands-on with primary sources, primary texts. And of course, introduction to the International Organization for Septuagint Cognate Studies. At the time, either John Weavers, when I first arrived, or Al Petersma was president. So that was my first introduction. I think 1984 was the first Society of Biblical Literature conference I went to in Chicago, and presented my first paper on the Psalms, the Syriac Psalms. And so getting to know people in the discipline was really important at the time, and people like Weavers and Petersma were really good mentors in that regard.
Yeah, it sounds like an all-encompassing experience, right? From the professors, the mentors that you had. Sounds like with your fellow students that they also took advantage of this and have really, excelled in the field. Being able to work on projects myself, I know, is a really important part of a good experience. So if you were to put these all together, what would you say is the most beneficial part of the training that you receive in all this?
Well, yeah, I would say it's a combination of those things. Obviously, being trained by people who are world-renowned specialists in the area of Septuagint studies. So that was vital to the process of my own formation and introduction to the world of Septuagint scholarship, about which, when I started, I had really very little knowledge. And then having the opportunities to and being encouraged to participate in a scholarly endeavors and scholarly scholarly organizations like SBL and IOSCS, and in Canada, the Canadian Society of Biblical Studies and that sort of thing. So just introducing me to that whole world, and being given opportunities to contribute in obviously initially very tentative ways, but that was the beginning.